Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second in our continuing series of virtual voices of the game. We're very glad to have with us on this Friday Jayson Stark. Jayson has covered baseball for over 30 years now, currently writes for The Athletic, also appears frequently on the MLB Network. Jayson has authored 3 books on baseball. And while he has many accomplishments, this might be at the top of the list. He's the 2019 winner of the J.G. Taylor Spink Award. It's an award given out by the Hall of Fame. And if you're a baseball writer, it's sort of like a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Academy Awards. I guess that would be a good way to describe it. Jayson, welcome to the program. How are you holding up under the circumstances?
Bruce, thank you. Doing well. These are interesting times. They're very different times, but at The Athletic, we continue to cover baseball, to write about baseball, and it's really cool to see how many people are still engaged and caring about it, and it really is keeping me and all of us going.
Yeah, we're going to talk about what your workload is like now and what you're trying to write about, because there's no current events going on in baseball. There's always the history of the game. There's the anticipation of the game, but no actual games, no spring training, nothing like that going on currently. We do hope that's going to change in the near future. I want to go back to your childhood, Jayson. I'm always curious in talking to writers, historians, broadcasters, about how they got started as a baseball fan. People will ask me about that. It was because of my father. My father was a huge fan. He didn't force me to become a fan, but he exposed me to baseball, and I liked it, and I started collecting cards at the age of 7. How about for you, Jayson? How did it begin growing up in Philadelphia?
Bruce, I'm really one of those lucky people walking around planet Earth, because I got to do exactly what I always dreamed of doing from the time I was old enough to dream about doing anything. Seriously, at 10 years old, I already had this idea that I wanted to grow up and be a baseball writer, be a sports writer. And I'm sitting in my office right now in Pennsylvania, and maybe 15 feet away from me is a picture hanging on my wall, and it's a photo of me and my sister, Karen, walking home from school. We're pretty sure I was in 5th grade. She was in 4th grade. And below it, there's a little composition that she wrote for school. Again, she was in 4th grade. I was in 5th. And it was about her brother, the baseball nut. And it actually says in there, if you ever wanted to know anything about baseball, you should probably ask my brother. And every once in a while, I'll look at that thing and read that line and think, oh my God, how did this happen? I really can't explain it. I just know that, I fell in love with baseball at a really young age. My mom, June Stark, was a great writer, and she infused in me the love of writing and reading. And somehow that started me on this journey, and here I am.
Yeah. Did your sister really call you the baseball nut?
She called me a lot of stuff. She in the composition, she wrote that she had, every once in a while, she would have nightmares that she was going to wake up and that there's going to be baseball games going on in her room, right? So yeah. Apparently I was kind of obsessed.
Growing up in Philadelphia, naturally you become a Phillies fan, and this was one of your favorite players. This was a guy that you followed, and then you ended up meeting him and talking to him quite a bit during the course of his life, Johnny Callison.
Yeah, we all had that first favorite team, right, that we rooted for. And for me, that first team that I can really remember getting completely caught up in was the 1964 Phillies. One of those many Philadelphia teams where the season lasted just a little too long, but great personalities, great theater. Johnny Callison was the guy who hit that game-winning home run in the All-Star game. Loved watching Johnny Callison play. And like the really cool thing was, so many years later, I wound up being a baseball writer in Philadelphia, and I got to meet and get to know Johnny Callison a little bit. And I found out he was hilarious. So as somebody who was always looking for the funniest people out there I could talk to about stuff about baseball, I would find excuses to call Johnny Callison. And he used to work at this bar restaurant in Bucks County. And I remember calling there one time looking for him, and they said, "No, Johnny's not here. He's out taking batting practice." Then they made that up because he actually wasn't. But I was following around the 1988 Orioles team that started the season 0-21. And so they began to approach the all-time longest losing streak by any baseball team since 1900. The 1961 Phillies lost 23 games in a row, and on that team was Johnny Callison. So as a guy who was looking for reasons to talk to Johnny Callison, called him up and said, "Johnny, you paying any attention to these 1988 Orioles?" And he said, "Absolutely. I watch every game. I'm rooting for them. Get me out of that record book." It was awesome. So I love Johnny Callison for many reasons.
Younger fans might not realize what a terrific player Johnny Callison was. If you saw him play, if you grew up with baseball in the 60s and 70s, you remember Johnny really well. I remember him toward the tail end. I grew up as a Yankee fan. He actually played for the Yankees, but he was really just a fragment of the player he once had been. But in his early days, a 5-tool player, could run, hit with power, tremendous throwing arm, excellent outfielder, and a guy that if he had aged better, he had a lot of injuries, back problems, knee problems, but if he had aged better as a player, might have been a Hall of Famer.
Well, he had a 5, 6, 7-year period at the start of his career, 1961 through 66, 67. I remember writing about this in my Stark Truth book, in which, his numbers, the impact that he made on both sides of the ball compared with anybody. I remember making a case that really he and Hank Aaron were the greatest, and Frank Robinson were the greatest right fielders of that era. And if you're in that sentence, Hank Aaron, Frank Robinson, Johnny Callison, you're a pretty good player.
First time you met him, what was that like?
Well, it's funny. I'm sure a lot of people who cover baseball have this experience. We talk to baseball players all the time, but there are those guys that we cover, and then there are those guys who were the great players of our childhood. Johnny Callison was one of them, and it was intimidating to me the first time the Phillies brought the 1964 Phillies alumni back to town for one of those alumni events. I was in awe of all of those guys, Callison, Dick Allen, Jim Bunning, Chris Short. And it was different to talk to them than the guys I covered. Because I talked to Johnny Callison probably more than anybody else in that group, he kind of crossed that barrier for me to where we just had this fun relationship. But in the beginning, it was really intimidating and awesome. I actually had the same experience last July in Cooperstown with Hank Aaron. I remember on that Sunday before the induction ceremony, I'm in a room with the greatest living players, and Hank Aaron was in the room. I had never spoken to Hank Aaron. I thought, when am I going to get that chance? Right, so I went up and introduced myself. Bud Silly was there. Bud introduced me, and we just had a wonderful conversation. And that's a memory for a lifetime. But I mean, seriously, Hank Aaron was one of those iconic figures to me. He was not just a player; he was Mount Rushmore. Right? It's like if you got a chance to talk to those faces on Mount Rushmore, what you'd say to them, how you'd feel. That was me with Hank Aaron. And once upon a time, that was me with Johnny Callison.
Jayson, you mentioned coming to Cooperstown, and I know you've been there many, many times. Here's a great photo from up above. There's our beautiful Otsego. You can see toward the left side of the screen the Otesaga Hotel, which is the closest thing we have to a skyscraper here at 5 stories. You can see Doubleday Field. And as you were pointing out to me before we began the program, It's actually a full crowd, so this perhaps a Hall of Fame Classic game, or it might have been when they were still doing the Hall of Fame game between two major league teams. About how many times have you been to Cooperstown? I mean, it's got to be dozens at this point.
Well, it's definitely double figures. I'd have to figure it out. But you know, I don't just love going to Cooperstown an induction weekend in our house. We love going to Cooperstown anytime, spring, fall, winter. My wife actually went up to Cooperstown last April without me, my wife and sister-in-law, so that was cool. And, we love to go back in the winter. There's nobody around, and you have the town to yourself, every shop to yourself, every restaurant to yourself, the Hall of Fame gallery to yourself. And last July was kind of hectic for me for some reason. But sure, those other times just remind us that Cooperstown is one of the magical places on earth. I like to call it the Magic Kingdom.
You've been to Cooperstown, as you say, double figures many times on writing assignments. Sometimes you just come up for fun because you like it. Last year you had to be here, though, because you were one of the honorees. You received the J.G. Taylor Spink Award as one of the fine writers in baseball history, your lifetime contributions to the game, writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer, writing and broadcasting for ESPN, of course, now writing for The Athletic. You're an accomplished public speaker. You're used to doing that. What was it like getting up in front of that throng of about 50,000 people at the Clark Sports Center? Were you nervous, or was this relatively routine given your public speaking abilities?
What do you think? I've given a lot of speeches, written a lot of speeches. I've never given that speech or written that speech. It took me seriously 8 weeks to write this speech. Wow. Not that I spent every waking second on it. I do have a day job, but just kept going back to it because, you only get to give that one time. And I knew that there were things I wanted to say, people I wanted to thank, messages I wanted to make sure I got to. And I wrote a speech. Took a week, didn't look at it, came back to it and said, no, this isn't it, and pretty much ripped that entire speech up and wrote a whole new one. And I literally worked on it up until that morning when I gave it. So it was quite an experience. But the entire weekend was an out-of-body experience in many ways. Just memories for a lifetime, And the cool thing was not just for me, but for so many people that I care about and love, who were able to be there. We had over 100 friends and family there. My wife and kids, my sister and her family and their kids. My wife's mom, Norma, got there at age 92. She made it into my Hall of Fame speech. I'll remind her of that pretty regularly. And just people came from all over the country. It was incredible just for me. And they all walked around for that entire weekend with this glow on their face. The other thing that I'll never forget is how I was treated by the greatest players who ever lived. From the moment that Wade Boggs walked up to me in the Otis Saga on Thursday night and said, "Welcome to the club." That's just how they treated me. Like I was one of them, even though I do have a baseball card, as you mentioned, Bruce, but if you look in the back of it, my numbers look a lot different than theirs because mine are non-existent. But those people were amazing to me.
Did it feel awkward for you, Jayson, being the center of attention? Because usually you attend the ceremony, you're interviewing other people, you're interviewing the great players or other great writers who are receiving their awards. Was it a bit strange being on the other side of that equation?
That was an experience unlike anything that's ever happened to me. And I'll tell you when it hit me. The year before, I'd gone to that very same ceremony on Saturday afternoon at Doubleday Field to see my friend Bob Costas give his speech. And as I was walking into Doubleday Field, I ran into a friend of mine, and he said to me, "I'm coming back here next year for you." And like everybody knew I was on the ballot then. I had no idea I was going to win, right? But that was the moment it really dawned on me. I looked around, and there was Doubleday Field, packed with thousands of people. I looked down at that podium and that stage and had this incredible wave that came over me, thinking, oh my God, next year that could be me. And it really did. It hit me then. I never stopped thinking about it up to the moment I gave the speech, because I could really imagine myself out there in that audience watching. Yeah, that was just, there was so many surreal, out-of-body moments, but to be standing there at that podium, looking into the eyes of my friends and my family, I'll never forget it, never.
Yeah. Well, in these photos, you look very happy, obviously, but it's probably a good thing there's a podium there to cover the shaking legs, right?
It's a little shaking. You know, I was so lucky that I sat next to Brooks Robinson up there on stage, and Brooks, as you know, is just one of those wonderful, warm, welcoming, engaging people and he just did his best to help me relax as much as that was possible. And that's really what happened that entire day. You know, that Saturday before the ceremony, you gather in a room in the Otis Saga. I'm wearing my Otis Saga sweater here, by the way. I hope you can see that.
Oh,
and
really?
I got there first, and I didn't want to be late for my own induction, right, or my own speech. So, you know, there were only a few people there, and we were chatting, and, you know, a player would enter, another player would enter. And, you know, maybe about 20 minutes in, I looked around, and I realized who else was in the room. It was an overwhelming feeling to realize that the greatest players on earth were in that room, and also I was there, right? And so I thought, you know what, I need to get up. I need to breathe for a minute. So I thought, okay, I'll just walk down the hall. I'll go to the men's room just to breathe and relax. And the next thing I know, Jeff Bagwell's walking alongside me, and he says, "How are you doing?" And I said, "You know what, Jeff, I'm doing okay, but I have to admit, looking around at everybody in that room, I just keep having this feeling, what am I doing in that room?" And he says to me, "Oh yeah, me too." I said, "You too? Wait a second. You realize you're a Hall of Famer, right?" He said, "Oh, I know, but I don't consider myself to be a Hall of Famer the way these guys are Hall of Famers." And that really helped relax me to know that it wasn't just me, that there is just something magical about being in the presence of those people. And then the other guy who really took care of me was Jim Thome. You know, we went to get on the bus to go to Doubleday Field for me to give my speech. And I got on that bus and realized I had no idea what to do. I didn't know where to sit. I didn't know anything. And Jim Thome was sitting there maybe 5 or 6 rows back, and he had an empty seat next to him. And he kind of patted the seat like, "Come sit with me." Right? So I went and sat next to him. And he's another guy, just warm and welcoming, just a regular person who happened to hit 600 homers. And we had a great talk because he had just been the year before. And so I said to him, "Jim, I have a question for you. You know, people will tell you, don't look at your family. It'll be too emotional." And he said, "Oh, no." He said, "You've got to look at your family when you talk about them. That's what it's all about. It's sharing it with those people who made it all possible." And I was so glad that he gave me that advice, because as I spoke about my wife and my kids and my family, I looked every one of them right in the eye, and I'll never forget the looks on their faces as I was talking about them. And I talked about memories for a lifetime. Those are really special memories for a lifetime.
Curious, Jayson, did you have a favorite baseball writer growing up? Did you pay attention to things like that?
Well, I grew up in Philadelphia and got to read the great sports writers of Philadelphia. I had many of those writers I just loved to read. And when I was a kid, I started writing to Stan Hochman.
Mm.
Years later, Tyler Kepner would write to me, and I always think about the fact that I would write to Stan Hochman, and he would write me back, and how much that meant to me. And so, I always wrote back to guys like Tyler, and to try to pay it forward and to inspire them. And the fact that Stan always wrote back to me was just so special and meaningful. And we would talk about it every once in a while. He was just a great, great man, an incredible writer. And then when it began to dawn on me that I wanted to be a baseball writer, I didn't just read Peter Gammons. I idolized Peter. I studied Peter intently. I subscribed wherever I was to the Boston Globe just so I could read Peter Gammons and try to figure out what was so great about this guy. I mean, Peter, when Peter wrote about baseball, it wasn't just about baseball. He could weave Little Feat into a game story. He could weave the last novel he read into a game story. There were all kinds of references to life and popular culture that were great. And then, later when I first started covering baseball just a little at the Providence Journal, they'd let me cover some games from time to time. I would honestly follow Peter around the locker room just so I would learn how to do it, how to ask questions, how to interact with players. Those would be probably the two guys that had the greatest impact on me and the way I write and the way I do my job.
Two good guys to follow without question. Now you're writing for The Athletic at a time when just about any sports writer, whether it's baseball, football, what have you, is really facing a challenge. There are absolutely no games going on. The closest thing we've had to a sporting event was the start of the NFL draft last night, and that's, while entertaining and distracting, especially for football fans, it's not quite the same as a live game. How is it that you and maybe the other writers at The Athletic are facing this problem? What are you writing about? What are you delving into without live games?
Yeah, I learned this a long time ago, Bruce. You become a sports writer to write about sports. And there's nothing like the games. There's nothing like the moment. And those are the stories that we all got into the business to write. Right now, we can't write those stories, but there are always other kinds of stories to tell. And we're just telling those stories. I mean, I can just tell you about the two pieces that I've written this week, because I think it's an example of how we're all thinking right now. Sunday night on ESPN, the Michael Jordan miniseries began, the Last Dance. And I host a podcast at The Athletic with my friend Doug Glanville. And we were looking for, all right, what do we want to talk about this week? I said, why don't we get Terry Francona on our podcast? Terry was Michael Jordan's only professional baseball manager. That year that Michael played baseball, Terry Francona managed him both in Double-A, in the Southern League, and then in the Arizona Fall League. And Terry was my neighbor here in the suburbs in Philadelphia, and our kids played volleyball against each other, know him so well, and I heard so many of these Michael Jordan stories. I couldn't wait to tee him up to tell these stories. And so after he was on our podcast, I just wrote about him watching that show, thinking about Michael, and telling those stories. Like, he told a story that I just love. That it's not one he tells very often, but Arizona Fall League, he played in a series of pickup basketball games with Michael Jordan on Michael's team. And so in one of these games, he takes the last shot. He misses it. Curtis Pride's on the other team, rebounds, it goes down and dunks, and they lose. Terry took the last shot, but they've been playing all day, didn't think much of it. And he says, Michael comes up to him and he says, "Hey, I always shoot last." And Terry said, "Wait, what?" He said, "No, seriously, I always shoot last." And Terry says, the game was not on television. And Mike, he hears this sound, and Michael has kicked the basketball off the window at the very top of the gym, right? Because Michael Jordan always takes the last shot. And so he says, Michael starts walking ahead of him, and Terry tells the story, and he says, hey, Michael, now you know how I feel when I watch you try to hit a curveball. And so that was a story that linked to something that's going on in the world right now. It's just not a game, but it was very entertaining on many levels. The other thing I wrote is, I'm the curator of the weird and the wacky, and every December at the end of the year, I write a piece about the strange but true feats of that year that people just seem to love. So talking to my editor, Emma Spann, she said, why don't we pick out some of the strangest games that you've seen or you've written about, and let's really write about them, the strange but true games of the 21st century. So last week, I wrote about Benji Molina hitting a home run, but not even scoring a run on his own homer. That's because he got pinch run for during an instant replay. And then this week, I wrote about the other candidate for strangest but truest home run of the century, Bartolo Colon's home run 4 years ago. And, talked to one of his hitting coaches, talked to Kevin Plawecki, his catcher, who was also on base, Jerry Blevins, talked to Gary Cohen about his great call of the homer. The impossible has happened. And it was just so much fun to talk to those guys and laugh and then write that piece. And that's what we're doing. We're just weaving in these fun, nostalgic looks at the things that we love about baseball with news, with the Red Sox, with what is still happening right now and what is likely to happen. What we're finding, Bruce, is there may not be baseball right now, but there are still baseball fans. There are people who still want to write about baseball, and we're doing our best to connect with them. And I work with an incredibly talented group: Ken Rosenthal, Evan Drellick, Eno Saris, Mark Carrig. We have 45 of the best baseball writers ever assembled. It's an amazing team. And the stories that we have produced in this month and a half with no baseball games are amazing. Proud to be working for The Athletic right now.
Jayson, it's doubly tough because during the winter, there's trades, there's free agent signings, there's rumors of moves that are going to be happening. None of that is going on now. There are no trades. There's no free agent signings. There's not even rumors about what might be happening in terms of player transactions. None of that is going on. So this is an unforeseen and unprecedented challenge, I guess, for writers.
Well, it is. And, there are always stories to tell. And so it's time to use our imagination, use our creativity, use our vision, use our memory banks, and tell those stories. So some of the stories are still connected to where we are right now. Where is this leading? Where is this taking us? When baseball returns, what might it look like? And so there's a whole segment of story content just right there. I'm talking to people in baseball every day, trying to get a feel for that. And right now we're in just kind of this haze where it's Groundhog's Day, and every day is a little like the day that came before it for all of us. But it is leading somewhere. There's just a lot of possibilities on the tables. Try to explore them. But then, I don't know about you. I do miss baseball. I do watch these classic games. I admit that I check the standings and even the box scores of the Baseball Reference simulated season. I do that almost every day. At The Athletic, we're doing a simulated season. I love checking those standings. And, the simulation is not real life. But I didn't notice, for example, I live in Philadelphia. The Phillies got off to a really bad start in the Baseball Reference League. And people were getting incredibly agitated about a season that wasn't actually happening. It's amusing. So I might actually write about that at some point, how we're so deep into the alternative reality that it's becoming real. I'm sure we can all relate to that.
A lot of the writers that I read, they seem to be very pessimistic about the possibility of baseball. I guess I'm more of an optimist. Where do you stand? What's your hunch, your gut feeling? Do you think we'll have some kind of a season this year?
I tried not to say I'm optimistic about it because a lot could happen, but here's what I've noticed. I would say the people in baseball whom I'm talking with feel like they're incredibly determined to play. They're so motivated. So it's not optimism, it's motivation. There's a motivation to find a way to play. I think there's no path right now to playing with people in the seats. And that's really hard to grasp, but it's the only way to play. Travel is going to be limited, restricted. The kind of travel that teams are used to doing, that's not possible. And so that's why you're seeing some of these visions for baseball, in a contained universe in Arizona, or the version that's now seems like it's got some real legs is Arizona, Texas, Florida, dividing the teams into 3 groups. That one makes sense on a lot of levels. Arizona's tough because it's 3 time zones away from the East Coast. The heat is unbearable. If you're going to make this a television production, there's not enough fields. Teams would be playing at weird hours. It doesn't fit for a lot of reasons to put 30 teams in Arizona. But to start divvying up teams so that some are in the Central, some are in the East, you can have teams play games at the right time slot and still theoretically control who goes in and out of their little biospheres.
Yeah.
That's whether this is doable is still a big question. There are so many obstacles on so many levels, but as I said, there's incredible motivation to play. And so if that's what it takes, is doing that, not all season, but for a while, complete with massive testing and the ability to constantly monitor whether anybody is sick and to take the proper action if that happens. That's all part of it. Health is the very first and the biggest obstacle.
Under this proposed 3-state plan, which we've been reading about in recent days, would this be a realignment into 3 different leagues? So very much an aberration of a season. And basically, let's say you have 10 teams in Arizona, 10 in Texas, 10 in Florida. Does each group of 10 remain in that state for the entire season? And then we somehow figure out a playoff from that? How does that work?
Yeah, that part's a little unclear. I don't detect the sense that there's a lot of people in baseball who want to completely blow up the National and American leagues. And so, to pull this off, you can still do it and have teams play within their league to a point. You need a completely different schedule. And, they do have computerized schedule models now that make that possible. Ideally, at some point, you could have certain teams rotate into another setting. But the plan is not to do this all season. The plan is to do it for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, hopefully then have the freedom to have teams go back and play in their home cities, to travel more freely, play initially with no fans, then maybe play later with limited fans. We just have to see where it goes. Baseball's no different than any other segment of society right now. There are a lot of plans and a lot of thoughts, a lot of hopes and a lot of dreams, but nobody really knows for sure what reality is going to look like on the other side.
It hasn't gotten a lot of publicity, Jayson, but they're playing professional baseball in Taiwan. I think they've been playing for about 10 days now.
Yep.
So far, so good. Is baseball keeping a close eye on what's going on there?
Really close eye on Taiwan, on Korea, on Japan, on China, because all of those places have tried to resume sports with very different results, setbacks. Taiwan's interesting because they're actually playing with no fans. They have cardboard cutouts. They have robots. They have cheerleaders, but they don't have fans. And I've watched a whole lot of this. I was curious about it. I did ask somebody at Major League Baseball what the robot budget looked like, and they told me it's not real big, in case you're wondering.
Do the robots cheer? Is that what they're there for?
I'm assuming you could program the robots to cheer. I'm not clear on whether the Taiwanese robots are doing much of anything.
Yeah, that is the surreal, or one of the many surreal aspects to this whole situation. We're continuing our virtual voices of the game with the acclaimed sports writer, baseball writer, Jayson Stark, the winner of the 2019 Spink Award for his contributions to baseball writing over a fantastic career. We will take your questions in a few minutes via the chat box. So if you look on your computer, you'll see a chat function and you can type in questions. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can. A few other topics to cover. Jayson, just a few weeks ago, we lost beloved Hall of Famer, a player that you didn't really see play, but you did have a chance to meet him, to interview him. Tell us your thoughts on Al Kaline, what he was like.
What a great man. I didn't get to know Al Kaline until long after he'd finished playing, but I spent a lot of spring trainings in Florida, on the west coast of Florida, and made many, many, many trips to Lakeland, Florida, where the Tigers train. And it was incredible that you could walk into the Tigers locker room at 7:45 in the morning in February or March, and Al Kaline would be sitting there in full uniform at 80 years old. And I'll admit it, I always look for excuses to talk to Al and to pick his brain, because Al was one of those very, very special, iconic players who never thought of himself as anything special. He was so humble, so welcoming, so friendly, so normal, so interested and interesting. Always interested in what everyone around him thought, saw, experienced. And, I love to talk to Al about, say, Miguel Cabrera, for example, right? Because he would tell me always, Miggy's way better than I ever was, way better. He said he told me once he reminded him of Ted Williams. And I said, why was that? He said, because he has such great feel for the moment and for what pitchers are trying to do. He said, I remember once that I asked Ted Williams, Ted, you ever guess at home plate? And Ted said, Al, I never guess, I anticipate. And Al Kaline said to me, that's Miggy. Miggy anticipates. I also remember the first time that Al ever had a chance to meet Bryce Harper. The Nationals came to Lakeland for a spring training game. Bryce was a few years into his career at this point, and Bryce made the trip. And think about why Al Kaline would be so interested in Bryce Harper. How old were they both when they made it to the big leagues? The fraternity of great players who arrive in the big leagues as teenagers is really small and tight. And Al Kaline actually told me he didn't know if he felt right introducing himself to Bryce Harper. This is Al Kaline we're talking about, right? And I said, you know what, Al? You should make it a point to talk to Bryce. I'll be happy to introduce you if you want, but you really enjoy it, because I guarantee you, he'll know all about you and you'll love the conversation. And so I before I had a chance to introduce him, I noticed the two of them talking. And I remember him telling me later, thanks for encouraging me to do that. What a great kid. I really loved talking to him. And he's another guy. He's got a chance to be way better than I ever was. And that was Al Kaline. Just always felt like everybody was better than him. Check the back of that baseball card on the screen sometime and see what Al Kaline did. What an amazing player, but a more amazing man.
This is one of my favorite cards of Al. It's from the 1972 Top Set. And, he had kind of an average build. He was not a huge guy. If you saw him out of uniform, you wouldn't necessarily know that he was a great baseball player. But he just carried himself with a certain stature. He had kind of a regal nature. I'd never known him to be a boastful player, but I had not known that he was so modest as you describe him. That's really amazing.
Yeah, and as you said, he just had a certain look and demeanor about him, and was in incredible shape right up to maybe the last few months before he died. Like, seriously, you would see him in the clubhouse at 80, 82 years old. He looked like he'd go out and hit cleanup. Wow. Yeah. That's right. He just had the way he carried himself. You thought, this guy's a star, even right now at 80 years old.
Yeah. We lost Al earlier this month at the age of 85, and certainly a tough loss for the Hall of Fame, the baseball community, and of course all the folks in Detroit where Kaline so revered and will continue to be revered for years to come. We're going to take some questions via the chat room. We have one here from Matt. Matt wants to know, does Jayson think there could be any rule changes, assuming that baseball does resume this year, with regard to social distancing? For example, maybe they would not have the home plate umpire. Maybe they would ban handshakes, maybe ban visits to the mound by the pitching coach and manager. Your thoughts on that, Jason?
Yeah, I would say all of that is on the table. How to socially distance in the setting of a baseball team going through its daily routine, playing games, all the pregame work, it's really challenging. And I'm like, how's the catcher going to socially distance from the batter, right? There's certain things that are really almost impossible to pull off. But, I know you've seen the talk about how they would have players sit in the stands and not the dugout, other than the guys who are about to hit that inning. There's going to be a need for shade if you're playing in Arizona or Texas in June or July. So I'll be interested to see how that works. In Taiwan, they have banned spitting. They have banned the pitcher going to his mouth. Like, oh, that's out.
Wow.
I want to see him try to figure out how to ban spitting. Okay, in the major leagues. But these are the things that are in play, and then lots of stuff in game. Whether the technology has advanced far enough to where you wouldn't have a home plate umpire standing there, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the worry is that some of these umpires are now up there in age, and they're in that age group where you have to be very careful of them being exposed to the virus. So I understand that. But even with electronic umpires, I've been to the Atlantic League, you've got to have an umpire standing there because stuff happens. Check swings happen. Sometimes the ball bounces and then goes through the strike zone area, and the electronic umpire thinks it's a strike, and you have a home plate umpire to overrule that. You've got plays at the plate. You got running lane issues. You still need a plate umpire, so I don't think it solves that. The other area that is clearly being talked about, Matt, is these games. There's going to be a need to play as many games in as compressed a period of time as we've ever seen, and so you're not going to. There's definitely going to be some kind of tiebreaker rule. Most likely the minor league tiebreaker rule, where start the 10th inning or the 11th inning possibly with runner on second, nobody out, to try to facilitate the chances of one team scoring. Double headers with 2 7-inning games or 1 9-inning game and a 7-inning game. There's just a lot of ideas like that are in play. They've all got to be agreed to, but part of it's for safety. Part of it is just to keep the games moving as much as possible.
Well, if there was ever a time to an experiment, this would be the time to do it if there is a resumption to the season. Here's a great question from Spencer. What non-journalism class would you recommend to a journalism student? Someone thinking ahead here.
Well, Spencer, that's a great question. I went to Syracuse. I actually dual majored, not just in communications at Newhouse, but in American Studies, just so it was a fairly unique major. It combined elements of history, literature, like all those things are really important. Anything that if you want to communicate, if you want to be in the communications business, you have to read. You have to expose yourself to great writers, great storytellers, people who know stuff, who are telling you stories about times that came before you, or who can create characters who don't actually exist but feel real. All that stuff is really important. So, if you're going to be in the communications business, you're going to tell all kinds of stories. You're not going to just tell stories of baseball games. So think about what other kinds of stories you can imagine yourself telling, and learn what you can about that whole area.
Jayson, during your career, one of the things that you've specialized in is, collecting tidbits of information, oddities, strange coincidences, things like that. So this question from Mike kind of ties into that. Jayson, what's the oddest or strangest baseball moment that you have either witnessed or covered live at the ballpark?
Well, it's funny. I talked about the Benji Molina home run earlier, where he hit a home run, didn't score in his own homer. I didn't cover that live, but I've written thousands of words about it. And I love that story because I think it's the idea that things are impossible until they're not. That intrigues me about baseball. And this is literally a one-of-a-kind moment. I'll tell the story. This is 2008. Benji Molina's on the Giants, and he hits a ball off the top of the right field wall. And because he's Benji Molina, right, he's not Billy Hamilton, he stops at first base. And so
probably the slowest runner in baseball at the time, right?
I would say it's fair to say that all Molinas operate in slow motion. Okay. So he pulls it to first base, and out comes Emmanuel Burris to pinch run for him, off trots Benji. But while all this is going on, Omar Vizquel is on the Giants at that point, and he comes up to Bruce Bochy and he says, "Hey, that ball was not a single. That was a home run. I heard it." And the story of how Omar Vizquel knew this was a home run by the sound is a great aspect to it, just in and of itself. But Bruce Bochy says, "Really?" And he was young, because Omar was the only guy in their dugout who heard this. And he said, "I would go challenge this if I were you." No, I didn't know until I went to write about it just this time. It was the first replay challenge of Bruce Bochy's career. Replay had just started a few weeks earlier. So he went to Bill Welke, the plate ump, and said, "Bruce, I know it's hard to tell," or "Bill, I know it's hard to tell, but that ball's a home run. And so go check the replay." They check the replay. They come out. They're spinning their fingers. Home run. Benji Molina puts his helmet back on. He's up to the top step of the dugout. Next thing you know, Manny Burris is finishing his trot. Okay. And so the Giants are going, "Wait, what's this?" And so Bruce Bochy goes out there. They're all agitated. Emmanuel Burris milks the trot, because when do you get a chance to do a home run trot when you didn't even actually hit a homer? And the umpires ruled that because Benji Molina was already out of the game, he couldn't re-enter even to complete his own home run trot. So that part's crazy. Then the really crazy part is, all right, imagine inputting this box score into your computer. There's one thing that all computers have in common. They believe the impossible is always impossible 100% of the time, right? So they don't believe that anybody could hit a home run but not score a run on their own homer. So even though Benji Molina's box score line should be 3-0-1-2, 0 runs scored, if you go to Baseball Reference, you'll find the wrong box score. It has 3-1-1-2. It has Benji Molina scoring the run. It also has a big 114-word preamble in which they don't just explain to you what happened. They explain to you that they disagreed with this ruling. So I didn't realize that this box score was still wrong 12 years later. Not because the computer wouldn't accept it at the time, but because Sean Foreman, the founder of Baseball Reference, refuses to change it because he thinks the umpires screwed it up. So we billed this as the home run that broke Baseball Reference. And Sean told me he's totally fine with that.
Yeah. So officially, Burris gets credit for the run scored, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And so Benjamin Molina hit a 2-run home run, but one of the guys he drove in was not him.
Wow, that's great. I've not heard that story. Question from Robert. Is there any chance of minor league teams being able to play actual games this year?
Wow, this looks a lot more remote, I'm afraid, because if you've read anything about this, talk to anybody in the minor leagues, unlike the major leagues, they don't want to play with no fans.
Yeah.
In the major leagues, between 30 and 40% of overall revenue in a normal season is derived from people coming to the park, in-game stadium revenue. The rest is TV money, media money, advanced media money. That's not true in the minor leagues. Almost all of their revenue comes from selling tickets. And so if you can't play with people in the seats, minor league teams probably are not going to want to play. Just it'll put them out of business. It's all cost and no revenue. But then that leads to other issues. You can't just have 26 players playing on a major league team. Guys get hurt, stuff happens. So you're going to need, kind of like what the NFL has, a big practice squad, taxi squad. You could have 40 players. You'd have 50 players. Guys would have to be ready to step in. It's going to be really bizarre. It'll literally be your practice squad playing simulated games or games on backfields, just like spring training or the Gulf Coast League or something. That whole aspect of it is going to be incredibly surreal.
Here's a really good question. It's from someone anonymously, but it's a great question nonetheless. How do Hall of Fame voters, writers view strike-ridden seasons when voting for the Hall of Fame? In other words, do players get credit for time missed, mental credit, if you will, from the writers? And is that something that should apply to the pandemic we're dealing with now? For example, you have players like Pujols and Trout and Kershaw. Theoretically, they're going to lose time from their careers through no fault of their own. How do you view that, Jayson?
I don't think that there's any doubt that in the past, those work stoppages have had an impact. I would just use the example of Fred McGriff. Fred McGriff finishes his career with 493 home runs. And if there's no strike in 1994 and 95, and he doesn't lose all those games, Fred McGriff's going to be in a 500 home run club. And I honestly believe he would be in the Hall of Fame right now. I think voters have evolved quite a bit even since then. We pay less attention to counting numbers and magic numbers than we ever have. And even if we do, I think those magic numbers are changing. You can't use 300 wins as a barometer of anything now. We may never see another 300 game winner. So we have to adjust. And we have so many great tools now to measure greatness, measure the dominance of players within their time, that we should use those. And I think that's going to apply to this season too. But people vote the way they vote for all kinds of reasons. And, it'll be interesting to see how many games they are able to play, which, in other words, how many games they are able to miss and the kind of impact it has. But everything is a factor. It always is. Hall of Fame voting. People ask me, what do you look at? I look at everything.
You look at everything. I guess the difference is players go out on strike. That's their decision. They've made that choice. Nobody chose what we're having today.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't know how similar you think this is, Bruce, to say the World War II or Korea and all the players who missed time then. You're a historian, and you know more about the details of those things than I do. But in my my first book, the Stark Truth book, I remember trying to assess Bob Feller and what Bob Feller would have been, what he would have done had he not gone off to war. And Bob Feller made the Hall of Fame anyway, as we all know. But if you give him back those years at that age, at the peak of his greatness, there's a real chance he wins close to 100 more games. And then we're talking about him as one of the greatest players one of the greatest pitchers who ever lived, as opposed to a great pitcher who lost time. And so this time that players don't play, especially through no fault of their own, for reasons that really have to do with other forces in the world, they do affect legacies, whether or not they affect whether these guys get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to try to end on a bit of a lighter note. I didn't know about this until I did an internet search on you. An Allen and Ginter Jayson Stark card. This is real, right?
It is a real Jayson Stark baseball card produced by Topps. It's like the whole vintage thing. I really should have been wearing like a 1932 St. Louis Browns jersey or something, right? But we had to do what we had to do. But it was, just Topps reached out to me, and they do this series of Allen and Ginter cards every year of some names in the media, people, big baseball lovers in the country, and somehow a few years back they chose me, and it's really cool to look at those cards. When I come to Cooperstown every year, people are carrying those cards around and have me sign them, and it's crazy. It's a crazy thing to have happen to anybody, because as I've mentioned earlier, if you turn that card over, there are no numbers on the back of that card. I talked about riding out to the ceremony with Jim Tomey. We were talking about how he sometimes feels like he's in awe of the other players in that group. And I said, he was trying to convince me, look, you're one of us now, you're family, you belong. And I said, Jim, I appreciate you saying this, but I'm totally aware that you hit 600 more home runs than I hit. And so to have 0 home runs on my baseball card and still have one, it's one of the greatest things I've ever achieved, right?
Absolutely. Did you have to sit for this portrait here? This is not a photograph. No. This is a portrait.
No, my wife actually took this photo, and we sent them a bunch of photos. This is the one that they chose. What I did have to do, though, was I had to sign hundreds of them with a special marker, and they have a guy, not just one, but there are several people who do this. They travel around and they get people who appear on these Allen and Ginter cards to sign the cards. They bring you the cards. They bring you the marker. They will meet you wherever you want to meet, and then you sign them. And then you do not keep any, right? I didn't get one of them. I sat there and signed for 2 hours. Never got one card. Now, eventually they sent me cards, but not those. Those are particularly special and valuable. So rather than like my usual cards being worth like $1.29, that's probably worth like $1.49. I don't know. Yeah. That's what they tell me.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big collector of cards. I don't have this one, so you got to bring me one the next time you come to Cooperstown.
Okay. That's a deal.
Right. And you're going to sign it for me too, all right?
Would love to do that.
Yeah. Jayson, this has been great. It's been a lot of fun. It's been insightful. I know it's been educational for our audience. We appreciate you being with us for this past hour, the great work that you do at The Athletic. We hope to see you back on MLB Network. They haven't been doing studio shows for a while. We hope that's going to change, and it'll definitely change if there is a start to the baseball season. We're both keeping our fingers crossed that that's going to happen. Thank you, Jayson.
Bruce, thank you. This was a real thrill and an honor to be part of this program. Love it. Love the Hall of Fame, and appreciate everything that you guys do. All be well, and I hope those gates to the Hall of Fame open soon.
Thanks, Jason. You're always welcome here in Cooperstown. Good guy, great writer, Jayson Stark. Very glad that he could join us for this past hour. We're going to do this again a week from today, next Friday at 11 a.m. Our guest will be somebody that Jason knows quite well, Brian Kenny of the MLB Network. And then 2 weeks from today, we will be talking to Janet Marie Smith, who works for the LA Dodgers. She is a ballpark architect, instrumental not only in building Camden Yards, but also in doing renovations to Dodger Stadium and Fenway Park. She used to work for the Red Sox, so she'll be our guest in 2 weeks. We thank you for all the questions. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.